All right, awesome. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it. It's our pleasure to be here chatting with everybody about Kendo UI, and we've got a list of questions here. I think I'm just gonna kick it off with that, some of the stuff that was asked, and we'll just go from there. Wait, team, how long are we going today? How long is this?
For about an hour.
About an hour. Okay, awesome. I'm gonna have to send for one of those giant coffees that Cody has. So we've got a couple questions here. I'm just going to start with this one from Victor, where the question is the number of rows, or is there a way to enable horizontal scrolling if a number of columns is quite large and their content becomes unreadable? Is Victor on the call? No? Victor?
Yes, I think he is.
He's here? Yes, there he is. Okay. So, the first thing that pops into my head as the answer to this is the frozen columns in the grid. Victor, were you able to take a look at that as a possible solution? He's in the chat window, so I'm just sort of waiting for him to pop back up here. Let me see if I can get back to that demo, and maybe we can show that a little bit. Frozen columns was one of the most highly requested features we ever had. And it took us a while to do it because of IE7. I mean, it's funny, but it's true. We have a lot of customers that still use IE7, but implementing this in IE7 was crazy hard. So let me see here. Yeah. Can you show the frozen columns? I can. Let me share my screen. Am I going to share a window or just all of my screen? I think I'm just sharing a window here. I'm learning this technology like live. This is awesome. Where is Chrome? There we go. Found it. All right, can everybody see my screen here? Are we good?
Yes.
Yes. So this is an example of having frozen columns. So you can see in this demo that you see 3 columns, but there's actually more. If I move over to the right, you can see that there's more columns here. But there's not enough room to display them. So what we've done is lock the first 2 columns and said that you can scroll over on these 3, and then these columns still have all of the functionality that the other columns have. And this is called frozen columns for the grid. If we jump down here to the source code, what you do is there's this locked and lockable attributes that you add on. And then when you do that, what the grid does is it automatically takes any columns that aren't locked and it causes them to move. So just with a Boolean value configuration on your grid. And that's been available since the Q1 release this year, I believe. We're now in Q2. So that would be the best way to put more columns than you have space for on a page with the Kendo UI grid. Let me jump to another question Victor has here. He says, the number of rows to display is limited to a certain size of data, rows and columns. Virtual scrolling disables some of the key features in the grid. Paging already works with retrieved data. What is the recommended approach for large data sets in a Kendo grid? Okay, so we get this question a lot, and here's my answer on putting large data in a grid. Don't do it. So if we back up a little bit, the way the Kendo UI grid works is it actually uses something similar to React.js. It has this notion of a virtual DOM. And it uses that to reserve a certain number of cells or rows, and then it just keeps reusing those as you scroll through it instead of trying to stick everything in the DOM. Obviously, the DOM is not a database, so the more items that you put into it and then try to sort, filter, group, aggregate, things don't work so well. So the best practice for grids and large sets of data is step 1, put your data, of course, on the server and let the server take care of all the filtering, sorting, grouping, aggregating. The data source will support all that, so you want to do all of that on the server, which is going to be easily the hardest part of the implementation. The second thing is going to be that you want to implement paging over virtual scrolling if that's an option for you, if you can get away with that usability tweak. Of course, having the grid, having the user pull through pages as they need them is going to give you a lot better performance than just letting people scroll willy-nilly and making AJAX calls as they scroll through. And then lastly, you want to reduce the number of columns that you have on the screen by as much as you possibly can. So while you can have frozen columns and they can extend on for an eternity, at some point the browser just can't keep up with the amount of data that's on the screen, and it begins to really lag. So with a little bit of, sort of conservatism in your grid and what you sort of allow on the screen, implementing server-side data actions and then favoring paging over virtual scrolling is the best way to get top performance out of your grid. Let's see here. We took 2 from Victor. Let's move on here. 2's enough, Victor. I'm sorry. I can't give you any more than that. And of course, you guys can follow up with Cody or I after this if you want to. My email address is holland@telerik.com. I don't know what Cody's is. Cody, do you have an email address?
Cody.Lindley@telerik.com.
Right. So you can email us directly, and we'd be happy to help look at your specific issues if you have them. Also, I'm going to drop into the chat window here. If you ever are on, let's see, like if you're on Stack Overflow, I can't get back to the chat window. Where is it at? More. There it is. If you're ever on, like Stack Overflow or something, he's saying how big is too big for the data grid. I would 100 rows is where I would stop before I went to paging. Let me see here. Let me just drop this in. So this dojo.telerik.com is similar to JS Fiddle or JS Bin or Plunker or any of these online tools, but the cool thing about it is that it automatically includes all of the Kendo UI assets in the page for you. So while you can add them in, this is just another tool to use. So if you're ever asking for help or emailing us or Stack Overflow, if you can try to like recreate your issue, it really helps us in figuring things out. It's Holland@Telerik. So he's asking, what's my email address? I just dropped it in here. Holland@Telerik.com. Let's move on to Christian. Christian's on the call. Aren't you, Christian? Maybe? Yeah, there he is. All right. So SPA, client-side storage and caching techniques. When to load data, at page startup or on the fly. It can depend. There's no reason to load the data from the server every time you navigate and activate an AngularJS controller. Should we let HTTP caching on the server handle it, or should we store it in HTML5 local storage? I think this is a broader question. And I'm going to bounce this one over to you, Cody, to get your thoughts on it. But here's where I kind of fall on this. If you're rendering a page initially, right? If you have to make if you're posting to the server and coming back, then you should go ahead and include any data that you're coming back with from the server if you can. So it may not always be possible, but if you're using something like MVC or PHP or some server-side framework that's allowing you to template out your pages, anything that you can get in the page that you don't have to go back and get from the server on a second trip is just one less request you have to make. So that's step one. As far as step two, when you're talking about AngularJS, Kendo UI, of course, does have Angular integrations, and you don't want to call the data source again every time that the page changes. And so the way that this works right now, and I'm trying to think through this, is that if you have separate pages in Angular and each one, say, has a Kendo UI grid on it, then there should be an attribute that's called, I think it's called krefresh, and you want to set that to false. And basically what that tells Kendo UI is when you get moved around, yeah, I believe it's krefresh. When you get moved around, we don't want you to go back and get new data, because sometimes you do want that, but sometimes you don't. So that's sort of the way that we handle that. As far as should we let HTTP caching or server handle it or HTML5 local storage, I think you can always, there's no official local storage support inside of the Kendo UI data source. You can always write your own. Local storage is just a key value store. Another good place to look is this Kendo UI Labs, which is a community project, and we have a lot of people that contribute stuff over here. And let me see. In fact, this one I think is actually under Brandon's. I'm not on GitHub. It's under bsatrum. There we go. And he actually has me see here. Among his repos where he's re-implementing Flappy Bird for some reason, he actually has a local storage adapter for the Kendo UI data source somewhere in here. And you can sort of see how he did this, but he just extended the data source and added in some local storage capabilities. So you can always have a look at that as well. And I'm not sure exactly where this is. Somewhere in this repo. Cody, any ideas on best practices?
Yeah, I mean, so as I understand the question, in my mind, the caching capabilities of a browser is, in my experience building applications, good enough, unless I would literally want an offline application. And then at that point, caching locally starts to make a lot of sense. I've not seen a performance issue with caching, network caching. It'd be interesting to hear your thinking around, am I thinking right about your question here? Like, it seems to me like you're wondering, is network caching enough? And if it's not, should we cache to some degree in the client? Is that the exact question?
Yeah, currently I don't have any performance issue, but I'm also in the startup phase. But I just think is currently whenever I go back and forth, say in a tab, between what I have as a project info and some project tasks view, then they each have a Angular controllers. So every time I switch between those, I reload the same data again and again. And of course, I mean, if it's not a performance issue, well, then it's not a problem. But I think it might be in the long run.
Yeah.
So, of course, I already use local storage to store the current user who is logged in. So I use also some JSON web token and store it in local storage. So I could also store all my data in local storage. But as you point out, if it's not an issue, then...
Yeah, I've not run into this issue before. Network caching has always worked, even if the perception is that I'm reloading my data. I've relied on network caching to negate the notion that it's reloading the data each time. Now, of course, you've got to make sure that your browser and your server are talking to each other and properly caching the data. I've just not seen a performance issue in relying on that factor. So,
yeah.
My experience.
So it sounds like HTTP caching is good enough.
Yes, certainly in my experience, that's been the case.
Yeah.
That was a good question. I want to jump over to one from Dan Parker here because it's kind of funny. He says, is everybody using Angular? That's some loud background noise. I think that may be you, Christian. All right? All right. Dan says, please eat that guy. So, wait, we're all doing the best we can. All right, is everyone using Angular instead of Kendo MVPM? I really like Kendo's MVPM, but I'm afraid it will get Sinofsky. I don't know what Sinofsky means. I assume he's referring to, will we drop our own MVPM like Silverlight? Yeah. No, we have no plans to do that. In fact, Kendo UI's MVPM, can you stop? Okay, yeah, sure. I can stop showing my screen so you can see my face. I didn't realize you guys wanted to see me that badly. Am I back? I am.
You're back.
All right. So we're not getting rid of our MVPM implementation anytime soon. You know, if we back up a little bit on Kendo UI MVPM, because it deserves a little bit of a history lesson here. When we first launched it, we sort of had this choice of, do we go with an MVPM library that's already in the industry, or do we go with one that do we write our own? And of course, the big MVPM library at that time was Knockout, right? That's the one that everybody was using. And so we looked very closely at using Knockout. Now, The reason why we didn't do that is because whenever you're creating a product, anytime you take a dependency on a library that you can't control, it throws all sorts of levels of complexity into the product. I mean, we have a hard enough time just keeping up with when jQuery does things, and jQuery is about as solid and mature as they get in terms of frameworks. And so what we decided to do was take some lessons from Knockout and implement an MVPM solution, or really an MV star solution in Kendo UI that would mimic some of the best features of Knockout, but would be something that we could tie in at the bare metal to make it as fast as possible. And so Kendo UI, if you start source diving and you go into the guts of the thing, the whole thing is built on this idea of observability. And even when we build Angular integrations, the Angular is actually going through the Kendo UI MVPM layer to make all of the bindings happen and just keep working. So, Angular is already sort of a layer removed from that. The MVPM is part of the core framework. It's not going to be Synopsky, and it's not going to be server-lighted as well either. So hopefully that puts your anxiety to rest there. Let's grab another one here. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a nice alternative if you don't buy in completely to the Angular way of doing things. I mean, there's a lot more to Angular than the MVVM pattern.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you're thinking that you need to use Angular so you can get like binding, or you can get like declarative initialization, where Angular has directives, Kendo UI actually does most of the things that Angular does on its own. It doesn't have modules and services and factories, and primarily it does not have dependency injection. We sort of rely on require.js for that. But it does have, Dan points out, it has routing as well. It's got views, it has layouts, it has everything that you would need to build a front-end application. The reason why we provide the deep Angular integration is because people just demanded it. They wanted it so badly. And we're for the people, man. Right, Cody? We listen to the people. It's not about what Cody wants. It's about what the people want. Here's one. Do you prefer Angular resource or HTTP? I prefer the Kendo UI data source. So again, this goes back to this question of Kendo UI MVVM. And when you're working with Kendo UI widgets, you have to go through the data source in order to get the data into the widgets. Your other alternative is to use an observable array or an observable object with widgets. But either way, you can use resource, you can use HTTP, but you're going to have to get back to the Kendo UI observables at some point. So when I'm working with Angular, I use the Kendo UI data source because the Kendo UI data source wraps observable objects for you, does all that for you, so that you're not then creating a new observable array and pushing items into it to keep your objects up to date. Got another one here. Best full-fledged example of a Kendo UI scheduler control. Let me jump back here. I may end up sharing my screen again. The scheduler, we talked about the scheduler being one of these sort of premium commercial grade widgets. Yeah, let me share my screen here. Share screen, there we go. And so here's the scheduler. I assume everybody can see this here. And this is one of those widgets where it's almost an app in and of itself. I mean, this is essentially the entire calendar portion of Outlook embedded in a browser, not the kind of thing that you would necessarily want to build. But all of our scheduler resources are here. So really the best place to look for scheduler demos is here, as we're going to go through and really show you all of the different things that you can do. I know that you asked specifically for AngularJS demo. There's one here at the bottom. It might not be quite what you're looking for, but it should be enough to get you started. And I should point out that if I come over here to this Angular and I click on edit this example, we talked about that dojo, that Telerik dojo. It'll actually drop all the code from the demo into the dojo, and then you can run it directly in your browser, and you can just tweak it here. This is a really good way to get started if you're just trying to proof of concept something out. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question, pointing in the right direction. Maybe if somebody's watching this later on, they can leave a comment about if they've implemented or know of another scheduler demo. That'd be great to see.
Okay, thank you.
Say again?
I just said thank you.
Oh, no problem. You're welcome. Let's see here. I've just dived into a large Kendo application and I need help on best practices for creating a really large spa. The MVPM view and spa classes are confusing. Not that I don't understand which one each one is supposed to do, but I just am not sure how they are supposed to all fit together. Man, that's a fantastic question. Kendo UI does have its own spa framework, and there's a whole article series that we have on getting started with the spa. So if you Google, and actually let me Google it first so I can make sure I put in the right links. And there's a set of screencasts as well. Let me see here. We provide a couple of demos at this link. And the demos, you know, people often ask, where's the source code for the demos? Well, it's all in sort of one file there, and that kind of gives you an idea of how the single page application functions. But yeah, that's a good one too. Thank you, Cody. Yeah, the spa examples, I think one of the things that's missing, and I agree with Dan here, is that there's no sort of best practice on how you should function, you should structure your app. And so one of the things that I did is, and I'll drop this in as well, are there any Visual Studio users here? I'm not looking at the chat window.
A little bit.
A little bit. So if you're a Visual Studio user, I actually created a spa template for you. Let me drop this in here. And you can just download that, add it to Visual Studio, and say File New Kendo UI Spa Application. And it will use require.js, and it will put the views in the appropriate folders, and it will give you an opinionated sort of structure for your application. Another one that you can do if you're not using Visual Studio is you can look at the Yeoman generator that we have. So let me pull that up. That's on GitHub as well. And that's just Yo Kendo UI. Let's see here, Kendo UI, generator Kendo UI. Drop this in. And this will do the same thing for you from the CLI if you're using Yeoman. The idea being that it's just going to scaffold out a spa for you. It's going to stick require.js in there, and it's going to separate it out so that you can see opinionated from me to you after looking at a lot of Kendo UI spas what the best way to structure an application is. So those are some good resources for you. And there's a lot of different opinions, and you know, I always try to remind folks, you know, there's never a single right way to do anything. There's only the right way for your application. And so take best practices, take my strong opinions, take your application and sort of fit it in as need be. Cody, do you have any thoughts there?
Probably just broad perspective. We offer a lot of solutions that are similar to Backbone. And even with Backbone, you still have the problem of how do all these parts fit together to actually architect and structure an application. And in that sense, it's very unopinionated, right? This is why we see a lot of people moving to Angular or Ember or something, but it's a really great question, and the answer, as Burke said, really is, it depends upon sort of how your brain works and the type of application you're trying to build. So one thing I could recommend if we're having a hard time figuring out how the parts go together is piggyback on a lot of the Backbone material about how to put an application together. Because you can take the same parts from Kendo that are similar to Backbone and follow the same strategies that they have in the Backbone community for a long time. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And actually, the Kendo UI spa implementation was inspired by Marionette, if anybody's familiar with the Marionette project, because at the time that we did it, Derek Bailey, the guy who wrote Marionette, was working for us here at Kendo UI, and Marionette is extremely well done, and is one of the things that makes Backbone very fun to work with, and so we try to follow that same pattern. I'm a huge fan of the Kendo UI spa implementation. I like it a lot. So, yeah. Let's jump into A very interesting question. This one's great. I'm gonna let Cody answer this. Actually, I'm gonna read it out loud, and then we'll see what Cody does. I was looking into Ionic. I would like to compare. Our application is, and then he gives the URL. I'm not gonna say it out loud. I don't know if he wants me to share that. Would like to see how we can improve the mobile support. That was from Andy. Is Andy on the line? Not in chat. Oh, okay. Cody, you want to take that one, or you want me to take that one?
Yeah, I would like to hear you start, and then I'll come in afterwards. How about that?
Sure, absolutely. So here's my feeling on this. I think that you should use whichever one of those best suits your application's needs. Both are open source. Both are supported on all the latest platforms. For anybody that's sort of up in the air about whether or not to build a hybrid app because of performance, that's almost a non-issue anymore. It's a great time to build hybrid apps. Ionic uses and is tied to Angular. So if you're very tied to Angular, that makes it a great choice. Kendo UI Mobile has its own application structure. And so if you're not so tied to Angular, then that makes Kendo UI Mobile a great choice. Now, I should note that in Q3, we're going to be releasing Angular integration for Kendo UI Mobile. So the same sort of integration Ionic offers, where you get one view and then you get another view with a transition and all that, and it sort of glues it all together for you. We're going to be offering that as well in Q3, just so that people that want to use Angular aren't prohibited from doing that from our framework. Now, I would say, let me talk specifically to Kendo UI Mobile, because I know more about that than I do Ionic, and sort of address when that would be a good choice. So Kendo UI Mobile has this idea of adaptive rendering, where it will, if you want it to, mimic the look and feel of the operating system depending on where it's running. It also works across BlackBerry, Windows Phone, iOS, and Android. So if you're trying to target, you get wide platform targeting with Kendo UI Mobile as well. And then Kendo UI has a flat theme, which is easily customizable with CSS, which is what you see from sort of the Ionics and the Ratchets, is this nice flat UI that's real attractive. And so we offer that as well. And then lastly, I would say that Kendo UI Mobile was built, almost 3 years ago, and it has always been a hybrid framework. So we were, in many terms, the first hybrid framework on the block that was designed specifically for hybrid development. What I mean by that is like PhoneGap and Cordova. And so if there's a problem in hybrid, you can bet we've hit it. I mean, we have been fighting the mobile web since it was cool to fight the mobile web. And we have bumped up just about against every monster you can bump up against. And so it's a very mature framework. It does a lot of things to increase performance strategy-wise. It uses the same sort of idea that iOS uses in its own, like say the list view, for example. The way an iOS list view works is iOS reserves cells that are off the screen above the list and below the list. And then as you scroll through, it just updates the cells with data. That's all it's doing. And so Kendo UI Mobile does the same thing. Now, on later devices, you don't even need to do this because the scrolling has gotten so good, and the overflow scroll, especially on iOS, is so good now that you can get native scrolling in your lists, no problem. So I would say you'll see improved mobile support for Kendo UI in Q3 with Angular, Kendo UI Mobile specifically. But you should look at both, Ionic and Kendo UI Mobile and make the decision about which one suits your project best. That would be my advice there. Cody, anything to add on that?
I think some discussion about performance and which one gets us closer to native on which platforms is probably relevant because, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, I don't believe Angular or Ionic's doing anything special on top of Angular as it pertains to the DOM, whereas, as I understand it, we do in mobile.
Yeah, we do. We're very specific. So we sniff out the platform first, and then once we have the platform, we make a lot of adjustments to the application based on what platform you're on. I mean, very specific CSS things and taking into account things like goofy icon font support on Windows Phone and places where CSS transitions do not work. So yeah, we do very specific operating system things in Kendo UI Mobile. Of course, at the time we built it, Android 2.3, I think, was the dominant version of Android. So we were doing all sorts of nutty stuff to try and make sure the old Android people could still access the apps.
Yeah, again, I think another point here is to make is if you're bought into the Angular way of thinking, then Ionic makes perfect sense. But if your brain doesn't work that way or you want a little more flexibility, then Kendo UI Mobile seems like a good fit in that scenario.
Yeah, or wait for Q3, which is November. So mid-November we'll release Angular integration for Kendo UI Mobile. So then you can have the best of both worlds. You can have your Angular and you can have your truly native experience. Okay, let's see here. Chad Evans says, I'm working with Angular and would be interested in the Kendo UI integration. Doesn't have any specific question, just wants to know about the best building blocks. I think the best thing about Angular is that it is so opinionated that it's it kind of tells you what building blocks you need to use. Something I've been a huge fan of lately is Todd Motto. Is that how you say his last name? Nobody knows? Let me drop this in here. Todd and John Papa. Where's Todd? Todd, I don't want your GitHub. I want your blog post. Here we go. So Todd has an opinionated, what he's calling a style guide here. I'm going to drop this in. Yeah, there we go. Oh, Cody beat me to it. No, not Todd England. No, Todd England. Todd England doesn't do anything. Todd England's our boss, by the way. Somebody had asked that. So Todd Motto's got this opinionated style guide. John Papa's got another one that goes into a little bit more depth. But man, if you're looking for best practices on structuring an Angular application, you can look there. If you're looking for best practices on specifically with Kendo UI's Angular integrations, there is a link that I can give you for that. Let me pull that up here. And I'm doing a lot of link searching on the fly. Let me see here. See if I can find this. I think it's in the wiki. Best practices. There we go. And we have some best practices for Kendo UI as well with Angular. So there we go. Hopefully that gets you going in the right direction. Check. Let's see. Vincent's a novice JavaScript programmer. I have a complex website that I want to build, and I want to have a mobile app, preferably hybrid, for the website. I learned about Kendo via the email that I received for the office hours. I'm interested in a lot of the UI for Kendo. I don't want to build these UIs from scratch. I've started to use Ember to build the app. However, Kendo seems to play better with Angular or maybe React for mobile apps. So I'm considering ditching Ember to go for Angular plus Kendo. Or can I use Kendo UI alone for a complex app? So I think that to answer that sort of statement first, we've kind of gone over that. Kendo UI Mobile has its own idea of an application. And so when you're assembling a Kendo UI Mobile application, what you do is you have views. And then when you're ready, when you're all finished, you use data role attributes and a lot of data attributes to configure the UI components. And when you're ready, you say new Kendo UI mobile application in your JavaScript, and you pass in the document, the whole document. And then Kendo UI mobile goes through and creates different mobile views out of your different views in your DOM, and then stitch everything together so that when you click on an anchor to a different view, instead of going to a different page, your view slides in like it should on mobile. So it's really taking the web and making it work as a native application. It's doing a ton for you under the covers. The Kendo UI application object does. Kendo UI mobile application object does. So the answer there is that you do not need, by any stretch of the imagination, Angular or Ember or anything else. Kendo UI Mobile alone is enough end to end.
Yeah, I just want to answer that in the context of the web widgets outside of the mobile widgets. The web widgets work standalone. It's not like they're tied to Angular. There are directives that we offer on top of Kendo UI to do Angular development. But the widgets will work anywhere. They'll work in a Backbone app, an Ember app, anywhere you want to use them. So I wouldn't abandon Ember.js in fear that our widgets won't work in that application.
I would say, I think the point we're trying to make, though, is if you're building a hybrid app and you think you need Angular or Ember with Kendo UI Mobile, you don't. There's no reason to add those in just for the sake of getting functionality that those libraries offer. Let's see, how easy is it to integrate Kendo UI Web into Kendo UI to web and mobile apps? I think Cody addressed that a little bit. You want to talk a little bit more about using just a date picker versus using more than that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm sitting here reading the question. Is he just simply asking if the web widgets run in a mobile scenario?
I'm not really sure. I wonder if he's just, to me it sounds like he's just asking how easy, if I have a React or an Ember application, how easy is it for me to just add in Kendo UI? Is that something I can do?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would look at it is it would be like adding, Kendo UI is jQuery-based. They are essentially jQuery plugins. So adding a Kendo UI widget is like adding a jQuery plugin to anything. So whether it's in a mobile context or a desktop context, it's still just a jQuery plugin in its most basic form. So it goes anywhere that a jQuery plugin would. So that's Ember, that's Backbone, that's wherever.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. If you want to use just a drop-down list, you can, right? You can just, and it's just jQuery. So select an element, Kendo drop-down list, and you've got a drop-down list. You don't have to use the MVPM. You don't have to use the SPA framework, the globalization, the validation. There's no, you don't have to adopt I'm going to use the term framework maybe out of context or in a bad way, but you don't have to adopt the library to get just the widget. And that's the sort of idea of pluggability. And we have tons of customers that do that, right? They just need a grid. That's all they want, right? Just give me a grid. I don't need anything else. No problem. Just take the grid.
Yeah. Looking through his question here, yeah, not only do the web widgets not run outside of something like Angular or any app, even our SPA frameworks solutions, but the mobile widgets, as of recently, I don't know what, Burke, do you know what release it was? But the mobile widgets also run outside of the application tools. So they are standalone, runnable. So that means you could use Ember to build a mobile app and use our mobile widgets in that Ember app.
Yeah, no, that is correct. You can. All of the mobile widgets have been decoupled from the application framework, so you can just call Kendo mobile list and get a mobile list view and use it anywhere with any framework. We've got there's a company called Wingspan that did some work with React and Kendo UI forms. And in fact, if you just Google Wingspan forms, they've got a whole GitHub repo where they go into using React with Kendo UI. I'm probably going to get some hate for this, but I'm not a huge fan of React just because it does take the DOM out of the equation. So it doesn't really click with my head, right? I want to write divs and I want to see that in the page and I don't want it in the JavaScript. But a lot of people love React and have done some really great stuff with Kendo UI and React. Last question, here's an interesting one from Vincent Cody. He says, once I build a web app, relatively complex website with a customer login and customer data, how can I leverage the Telerik platform to use as much possible the code that I've already written and turn that into an iOS or Android hybrid app? You want to talk about that, Cody? Maybe you could explain what the Telerik platform even is.
Yes, so he's using the term Telerik platform here. So the Telerik platform are a set of tools for building hybrid mobile applications, whether that's back-end testing, deploying, prototyping, building, specifically the app builder. It's just a set of tools to help you do all of this. So how can I leverage? If it's a complete front-end application, I would say you can, of course, reuse everything back-end, whether that's our back-end or somebody else's back-end, if it's architected correctly, because it seems like he's asking.
I think what he wants to do is take a web app and drop it into a hybrid app and have like an instant hybrid app. So I have kind of a strong opinion on this, and let me back up. And I know that he's talking about this in the context of App Builder, which is part of the Telerik platform. But App Builder is a tool that runs either in your browser or it's a Sublime text plugin. You can use it from the command line. You can add it to Visual Studio. And what it does is it scaffolds out mobile apps for you, hybrid, includes all the Cordova PhoneGap libraries, and then it includes an emulator or simulator so you can run it on the desktop, and then it includes a companion app so you can run it on your device and view it there, and then it includes build tools as well. So you can build for iOS, Android, Windows Phone, all from, say a PC, because it does all the builds up in the cloud in a secure build, and it destroys it and sends it back down to you over SSL. So just making that process a whole lot easier so you don't have to set up this crazy build tool chain to make PhoneGap apps. But the question about taking an app that's complex and dropping it in and making a hybrid app, I don't think that this should be done. I think that when you're talking about mobile apps, that if you're going to deliver it through the App Store, then you really need to be focused on building a hybrid app. Can you reuse some of what you've done, the logic? Absolutely. But this idea that I have a web page, I'm going to drop it into a PhoneGap or PhoneGap itself and have a native app, if you will, is not a good idea. It does not play out well. Mostly because a lot of the ideas that apply specifically to the web don't just translate one for one into a hybrid app.
Is Vincent on the call?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. I was stuck on something else, emergency there. So I'm a bit late, but I'm there.
Yeah, this is when you use the term web app, do you just mean the logic that runs in the client? Because I feel like a proper answer to the way this question is worded is simply, if you're using like our backend as a service, then of course you can reuse that entire portion of a web app. But what you mean by web app is all of the business logic that's running on the device or in the front end, depending upon how you build your app, then as Burke's saying, that's so tied to the UI, you can't just reuse that and deploy it to a native device. Does that make sense? But of course, if there's a decoupling between your front end and back end, that decoupling should enable you to use half of your app for anything. Or am I just being too obvious with that answer?
No. Just to be clear, my apology. I missed most of the first part of the meeting, but I was able to understand the last part that we were discussing about the web app. I'm all new to programming, and I started to build I have an idea for a website, bottom line, and I'm building that website right now. And so the question to me is, when you look at all the choice of technology that is out there, which are the right one, and which are the right one that will maybe, if I want to have something on a smartphone, enable me to have something that feel native to a certain extent, maybe not as all the connection with the phone and all the possibility, but feel good when you use it. And still, if possible, minimize as much as possible the rework I need to do. So bottom line, I think, yes, you did answer the question, is that you cannot take an app that is for the web, a complex website, and package it that easily into a phone gap, for example, to be able to use it on the phone directly. You need to do some kind of adaptation for it. But if half of the work is already done because you in the beginning choose a technology that enabled you to reuse part of it for the logic into when you develop your native app or hybrid app, I should say. You already saved that. So I'm kind of at that stage right now, trying to make the right selection so that down the line I don't have to redo maybe everything from the scratch. And one point to that was that I was if I was looking at Kendo technologies. The UI there, when you on a computer, you need to use the mouse, and when you're going on the phone, you want to be touch. So as Kendo is able to be able to basically when it's on the phone to use touch, or I need a different library, and how much what is the transition work? Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it completely does. I just want to stress the point that half of your app can be reused if it's properly decoupled and there's APIs to run your app. So everything you need to run your app can be reused. Everything that the application logic that drives the UI, in my opinion, and I believe this is Burke's as well, would need to be a separate code base for a web app or a mobile app. But in that answer, you still get to use half of everything that supports both apps, depending upon how you architect it.
Yeah. No, it does address that. And if you touch that early in the meeting, please don't go over it again. But I was trying to understand, you have this platform, the Telerik Platform, when you can develop stuff on it. I honestly was a little bit more interested in Ember myself. As the logic behind it, I can think through it. I put some time to learn it. Do they do well together, or are they working, two different type of project? My app will have a lot of, user logging and, user information and several windows. So I won't say it's a huge complex app, but it's not a simple app either. And it seems for me, Kendo, what I see right now, it's really more for the front end, what I like right now is all the UI that you have, the graph, the various things that since I'm a new, I don't need to redo it myself. I can integrate that to my application. I'm happy with it. But what is the next step? Should I stop there, or maybe should I go further?
Well, I think you got two choices then. If you want to get in the App Store, then you need to build a mobile app. And so if you're going to go the platform route, which for us as web developers that want to build native apps and don't want to write Objective-C or Swift and Java and C# and whatever, that's a great option. Hybrid is a fantastic option because it scales so well. But like Cody was saying, especially with Ember, because they make it really, really hard to do things wrong, just the UI portion of your application is going to have to be slightly different. Right? Because the UI paradigms on mobile are different than they are on the web. You have nav bars and tab strips and things that are specific to mobile. But you should be able to take a lot of your controllers from Ember and a lot of your application logic and use that directly in the hybrid application, which is easily, of course, the hardest part. We're providing UI. We're just asking the developer to provide the business engine.
Yeah.
And actually, we should follow up and see how that pans out for you. If we need to get you a license to the platform or whatever to make sure that you're successful there, because I would like to know, Ember's big claim is that we make it hard to do things wrong because Ember is so opinionated. And I would like to know, is that true, right? Do you have that experience importing from the web to a mobile device? That would be really good information.
Well, I will be happy to give you my feedback on it, and I guess this is why I like Ember, because I'm so new to all that thing. It's give me a framework that basically I'm not starting with a blank page. You see what I mean? So all the data portion, and the background, the way that the different data will speak to each other, and then connecting to a backend services. and so forth. It's, you know, once you make the connection to the various APIs and things like that, then, you know, I basically have to follow the recipes to a certain extent. So it's easier for me to take it bit by bit like that, and I don't have to worry about, you know, the URLs that, you know, if I do a one-page application, you know, one-page website, you know, all the URL are, you know, updated directly and so forth. So all of that is away from me. So since I was new to that, and I don't want to start from a blank page, bottom line is I like rather to invest the time to learn the various, you know, semantic and the various methods and so forth that Amber use, but at least I have a framework to work with rather than go the other route. And yeah, I'd be more than happy to give you a feedback after that of, you know, how am I evaluating with your UI and how when I'm there, because right now first step is to go with the website, and when I'm at the mobile section, tell you you know, how well I was able to take everything and how much of it I was able to take to put that back and, you know, into an hybrid hype.
Yeah, that would be great. Things are getting a little choppy for me. I think school's out and all the kids have their Xboxes on, and it is burying my internet connection.
Yeah, but we have limited. I think we have some limited time here, and in that conversation we're having with Vincent, there were some comments in the chat that I want to address really quickly, and maybe hear from you guys, especially Dan and Sean. Because there is this notion of like building something with Kendo UI widgets and then having them be adaptive to mobile devices. And I do want to say that is the case. Like our web widgets will adapt to mobile touch scenarios and run on touch devices. And if the premise of what you're building accounts for how those work in both scenarios, then of course that's a viable solution. I've personally never been on a project where the people designing the mobile app and the people designing the web app could live with the restraints of using one UI solution that adapts to both scenarios. Typically, the problems on mobile and the problems on web are so different that to make them stretch across both, I have not seen that work in complex apps, but they certainly do that. It'd be interesting to hear from Dan and Sean about your guys' experience about making what seems to be a web view stretch across multiple platforms and devices. Unless I'm misunderstanding your point, Dan. Did we lose Dan?
We may have lost Dan.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I just have been able to reuse the view models a lot. Like when I'm making the model view model, I'll take the view model into a separate JavaScript file and then load that JavaScript file in. So within the various forms and the binding, I can get the data from the same web service and then bind it and then create my view model and then bind it on a different HTML page.
Right.
So the HTML pages will be different, but it'll load the same view models in JavaScript. A lot of JavaScript will be shared. And I've been able to do that pretty well with Kendo UI.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think there is some potential reuse there that if done in a strategic way can the problem that would worry me in these scenarios is how does it scale over time when you start reusing like this? Is it better to keep things isolated and scale them over time, or sort of interlock them and scale them over time? And I think both can be done. It's just the diligence of the developers. But to extend on that, I do want to say that if your premise is to build, like a grid that runs appropriately from a UI perspective in a web browser, and also have that grid adapt and reuse it for a mobile situation, our widgets do that if you are in that particular scenario.
Okay. One other question I sort of had was, when I'm making a button, should I just always make it a Kindle mobile button? I mean,
That's a good question. Typically, yes, because so you either have an anchor with a data roll of button or a button with a data roll of button. And are you asking whether or not you should use an anchor or a button?
oh no, just because there's a Kendo button and there's a Kendo mobile button, right?
Yeah, the mobile, it's all the Kendo UI button does is it adds in a click binding at the data-click level, and then it skims. It adds a k-button class to a button or an anchor, which then skims the thing. That's all it does. It's very, very simple.
Okay.
So if you're in the context of mobile, I would use the mobile button. In the context of web, I would use the button.
Okay, but if your users are using the website on a mobile device, would it matter if it's like does it have better touch? If they're looking at your website on an iPad, is it better if they use a Kendo mobile button?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the answer to that be dependent upon if you're using the mobile widgets as standalone or if you're using them in the app?
Not necessarily, because, and I don't know, you know what, Dan, you may have to follow up with me on this because I think you're asking about the 300 millisecond click delay, essentially. Because Kendo UI Mobile swallows that 300 milliseconds. It basically busts it the same way as like FastClick does. But I don't know if the buttons do that outside of the context of a Kendo UI Mobile application object. And then there's another strategy that I sometimes use where I include the touch support from Kendo UI Mobile, and then I give every button a roll of touch. And then it looks for a touch first and then a click. So there's sort of two different ways you can go about doing this. But we can kind of figure that out together if you want to.
Okay, just a general question. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that sort of right now where my application's at, we have a lot of people just using the website instead of the mobile app because the mobile apps aren't done yet. And eventually we'll just make the mobile app. But it's sort of a transition spot right now when we just have the website up right now.
Sure.
So eventually when things get moved later on, we'll have our own app. So it won't really matter, but it's okay for now. I think I just use regular buttons.
Okay. Well, I think we're about out of time here. I know we're recording this, and I'm answering a question and talking at the same time. It's not going so well. But I want to thank everybody for coming out and hanging out with us for an hour out of your day. I mean, what an honor to be able to hang out and chat with you guys just about Kendo UI. That was awesome. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, great questions.